It was the kind of afternoon that made Greenville feel like the safest place on earth. Birds are circling above the lake, joggers passing by in rhythm. Families laughing under wide oak trees that had seen 100 summers. But peace, for some, is a privilege, and that peace was about to be shattered in 34 seconds. Danielle Monroe sat on a wooden bench near the water's edge, her spine straight, her hands wrapped around a thick, hardcover book, the kind with gold-pressed titles and footnotes. Her presence was quiet, but commanding. A navy blazer, jeans, and flats. No makeup, no phone in sight. Just a woman reading in a public park. And yet, for some people, that was already too much. From the far end of the trail, a white and blue patrol car slowed. Then it stopped. Two white officers, mid-40s, buzz cuts, stiff posture, sat inside for a beat longer than necessary, their eyes fixed on Danielle. There were other people in the park that day, families, teens with Bluetooth speakers. Someone even lighting a grill against posted rules. But none of them looked like her. None of them were alone. None of them were black. The cruiser pulled up to the curb, tires grinding softly against gravel. A door creaked open. The taller officer, Mason, stepped out first. His jaw was tight, his hand resting casually near his holster. His partner, Whitmore, followed, scanning the area like something had already gone wrong. "Ma'am," Mason called out, his tone clipped. "Can we speak with you for a moment?" Danielle looked up from her book, calm, centered, entirely unbothered. "Of course," she said, marking her page with the precision of someone who had nothing to hide. What happened next would unfold in under 5 minutes. It would be recorded. It would be shared. It would go viral. And it would change the trajectory of more than just Danielle's afternoon. Because what Mason and Whitmore didn't know, couldn't know, was who she was. They didn't know the courtroom she commanded just 6 blocks from that very bench. They didn't know the precedent-setting cases she'd won. They didn't know her name would soon appear on the docket in a different way, as the Honorable Judge Monroe. But that day, in that moment, all they saw was a black woman alone. And that was all it took. Danielle Monroe didn't flinch. As Officer Mason approached, boots cracking dry twigs beneath his feet, she closed her book with deliberate care, her thumb still tucked between the pages. The color of law, the spine read. A fitting choice, though she hadn't intended it that way. It was just part of her rotation, a habit she had formed from years of writing briefs that challenged injustice head-on. Danielle was a woman of quiet precision. A Harvard Law graduate, top of her class. She had built her reputation not on theatrics in the courtroom, but on the weight of logic, precedent, and her unshakable command of civil rights law. She had once overturned a city ordinance with a single, blistering paragraph. She knew the Constitution like she knew her own heartbeat, and she had spent her career making sure the system followed it. But today, the system came for her, in the form of 2 men who thought the badge on their chest outweighed the law she carried in her bones. "Can I help you with something, officers?" Danielle asked, her voice smooth but measured. Mason's eyes didn't waver. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "And what does that have to do with me?" Whitmore stepped in now, arms crossed. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Danielle glanced around theatrically, then back at them. "Sitting, reading, existing." It was the kind of answer that would rattle men who had been trained to expect fear. Mason didn't like it. "We're going to need to see some identification." There was no cause. No report matching her description, no reasonable suspicion, just skin, solitude, and the assumption that those 2 things together equaled threat. Danielle took a slow breath, not from panic, but calculation. She understood this game. She had represented too many who hadn't been given the chance to play it. "I'll show you my ID," she said, "but I'd like to know what I'm being accused of first." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, don't make this difficult." "Difficult?" Danielle echoed, her voice still steady, but carrying a sharper edge now. "You approached me. I'm just asking why." Mason stepped closer, now just a few feet away. His posture changed. Fewer officers, more enforcers. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The air between them thickened. The people nearby, joggers, dog walkers, parents, started to glance over. Most kept walking. Some didn't. "You people always want to argue," Mason muttered under his breath, but not low enough. Danielle froze, not in fear. In a decision. She could have let it slide, could have reached for her wallet and played it safe. But that's what she had been trained to do all her life: diffuse, de-escalate, shrink. Not today. "I'm not refusing," she said, pulling her ID from her purse and holding it up. "But I want this interaction to be as lawful as you claim it is." Mason snatched the card from her fingers and scanned it like it might bite him. "Danielle Monroe," he read aloud. "And what exactly is your business here, Miss Monroe?" Danielle met his gaze without blinking. "I live in this city. I pay taxes in this city. And I chose to spend my afternoon in a public park." Is that a crime? It should have ended there. But with men like Mason and Whitmore, men used to silence, submission, and unchecked authority, logic was gasoline. And Danielle had just lit a match. Danielle's ID was still warm in Mason's hand when the shift happened. "You're acting suspicious," he said flatly, handing the card back without meeting her eyes. "For sitting in a park?" Danielle replied, her voice calm but steel-laced. "What part of that is suspicious? The book? The bench? Or just me?" Whitmore's hand crept toward his belt, slow, deliberate. Not drawing his weapon, but close enough to let everyone know it was there. Danielle saw it. So did the man walking his dog. So did the young couple pushing a stroller. Everyone saw it. But no one said anything. Not yet. "We're asking the questions here," Mason snapped. "And you're making this harder than it needs to be." Danielle stood her ground, spine straight. "I've answered every question. I've given you an ID. You've accused me of nothing. If this is a lawful stop, I want to know on what grounds." That was it. The moment reason died and performance began. "You're resisting," Mason barked, reaching for her arm. "I'm not," Danielle began, pulling slightly away, more in shock than defiance. But the script had already been written. "Stop resisting!" he shouted again, louder this time for the crowd's benefit. Click. The unmistakable sound of a phone recording. A young woman in a green hoodie had pulled out her phone, holding it steady, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Danielle's heart thundered as cold metal clamped down on her wrists. The cuffs bit deep, punishing her not for a crime, but for audacity. The audacity to speak, to question, to exist unapologetically. "This isn't necessary," she said through clenched teeth as Mason yanked her toward the patrol car. "It's standard procedure," Whitmore muttered, eyes scanning the gathering crowd. "No, it's spectacle," Danielle shot back. The bystanders watched, some in silence, some whispering. A few raised phones, but they kept their distance. The air was no longer peaceful. It was loaded, tense. Watching a woman in business slacks and sensible shoes be dragged like a warning. Danielle turned her head as they approached the cruiser. Her eyes locked with the girl in the hoodie, still filming, her hands trembling but steady enough to capture everything. For a moment, Danielle's expression shifted. Not fear, not rage, but a plea. Don't stop recording. Then the car door slammed, cutting her off from the world outside. The ride to the station was silent, except for the scratchy hum of police radio and the tightness in her chest. Danielle stared out the window, watching her reflection smear across fast-passing trees and stoplights. Inside the precinct, humiliation came in layers. She was fingerprinted, searched, photographed under flickering fluorescent lights like a common criminal. The officers barely looked her in the eye. "Enjoy your stay," Mason sneered as he slammed the holding cell door behind her. Danielle sat on the cold bench, her wrists red and raw. For the first time in a long time, she was on the wrong side of the system. The same system she had once defended, trusted, even believed she could change from within. Now it was swallowing her whole. Not because she broke the law, but because she dared to ask why. Danielle Monroe didn't sleep that night. After posting bail, after the fingerprinting, after the mugshot, after the fluorescent lights and the hollow clink of a cell door closing behind her, she went home, made a cup of coffee she never drank, and opened her laptop. No crying, no pacing. Just strategy. The cuffs had left red welts on her wrists. She barely noticed. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up federal civil rights codes, case precedents, and internal police conduct policies. She knew the system from the inside, and now she'd hold it accountable from the outside. She had fought for others her entire career. 10 years of defending black teenagers pulled over for nothing. Mothers grieving sons, they shouldn't have buried them. Employees passed over, tenants pushed out, citizens pushed down. She'd written motions at 3 a.m. to save people she'd never met, and now it was her name on the complaint. This wouldn't be emotional, it would be methodical, surgical, and it would hurt. The next morning, the video surfaced, shot by a college student in a green hoodie, just over 2 minutes long. Blurry at the edges, shaky hands, but the sound was clear, the officer shouting, "Stop resisting," while Danielle calmly said, "I'm not resisting." It was all there. The park, the cuffs, her book dropped to the ground. By noon, the video had hit 80,000 views on TikTok. By evening, a civil rights group had reached out. By the end of the week, it had passed 1 million. And people began to recognize her. "That's Judge Monroe's voice," one commenter wrote. "She teaches constitutional law at the university," another added. "This is who they arrested?" The hashtag took off. Justice for Danielle. Danielle didn't engage online. She didn't need to. The streets did it for her. The community of Greenville, black, white, Latinx, Asian, saw something they couldn't unsee. Not just a woman in cuffs. But which woman? A legal mind, a respected figure. A neighbor. And that made it real. Because if it could happen to her, what did that say about the rest of them? Danielle got to work. The lawsuit was no longer just a complaint. It was a weapon. She filed against Officers Mason and Whitmore for unlawful detention, racial profiling, and abuse of authority. But she didn't stop there. She named the City of Greenville Police Department as a co-defendant, citing a lack of training, failure to discipline, and a documented pattern of discriminatory stops. It wasn't personal. It was systemic, and she had the case law to prove it. Danielle assembled a small legal team, not high-powered names from D.C., but grassroots attorneys from the Carolinas. Colleagues who knew this fight, lived this fight, and carried it in their bones. They met around her kitchen table like generals preparing for war. Laptops open, notes everywhere, depositions scheduled. Danielle didn't just want compensation, She wanted exposure, policy change, oversight. Retraining, a paper trail that future lawyers could build on. Late one night, Marissa, her closest friend and fellow attorney, looked at her across the table. "You know this isn't just about you anymore, right?" Danielle nodded, eyes still on her screen. "I know," she said, and then quieter. "That's why I can't afford to lose." It came in an email. No bold letters, no flashing alerts, just a standard subject line sitting quietly in Danielle's inbox. Judicial assignment notification, internal hearing, officers Mason and Whitmore. She clicked it without thinking. And froze. For a long moment, the screen just stared back. The same names. The same men, the ones who cuffed her in broad daylight, the ones who made her a suspect for sitting on a park bench with a book in her hand. Now they were defendants, and she was the presiding judge. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse corridors felt different. Quieter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. This wasn't a criminal trial. No headlines, no cameras, just an internal disciplinary review, a procedural formality, usually unnoticed, unremarkable. But not today. Courtroom 3B was packed, not just with attorneys and clerks, but with people who heard. Who knew? The kind of people who didn't speak the truth out loud, but passed it between looks. And when officers Mason and Whitmore entered, they were still unaware. Mason walked in first, posture puffed, uniform crisp. Whitmore followed, flipping through case files like he was preparing for a routine QA. They sat and waited. The door behind the bench opened. The room shifted. Danielle stepped out, her robe flowing, her chin steady. No hesitation, no dramatic pause. But the silence that followed her arrival wasn't ordinary. It was recognition. Whitmore's pen dropped. Mason's mouth parted slightly. Their shoulders stiffened as reality crept in, quiet and ruthless. This wasn't a setup. This was a reckoning. Danielle took her seat. Her gavel struck once, sharp, absolute. "This disciplinary hearing is now in session. Please be seated." And for the first time, they obeyed her. The irony burned just beneath the surface, but Danielle didn't let it rise. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. Her tone remained clinical and composed. She read the charges without commentary, called witnesses without inflection, followed protocol like scripture. Because power, real power, doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. She asked questions. She took notes, and every time she addressed Mason or Whitmore, they flinched. Not physically. Not outwardly, but enough. Enough to show the room, and themselves, that the ground had shifted. That the woman they tried to humiliate now held their careers in the balance. During a short recess, the two officers stepped into the hallway with their attorney. "She can't do this." "This is biased," Mason hissed. "It's not bias," the attorney muttered. "It's karma. Sit down and act like you've still got a chance." They didn't argue again, because they knew, even if she never raised her voice, never looked down on them, never said a word about that day in the park, she was not the same woman they tried to reduce. She was more. Now she was the law in that room, and for the first time, they would have to answer to it. By the second day of hearings, the courthouse had transformed into a pressure cooker. The story had broken. What began as an internal review was now national news. Judge presides over case against officers who once arrested her blazed across headlines. Commentators debated ethics, pundits questioned neutrality, But outside courtroom 3B, the people had made up their minds. They weren't just watching a disciplinary hearing. They were watching history turn on its axis. Inside the room, Danielle Monroe sat motionless behind the bench, her expression unreadable. Every movement was intentional. Every blink is calculated. She wasn't here to be the story. She was here to reveal it. The prosecutor stood and adjusted his tie. "Your Honor," he said, glancing briefly toward Danielle before turning to the gallery. "We call Ethan Rhodes to the stand." The room exhaled as the door opened. Ethan couldn't have been more than 21. Skinny frame, nervous hands. His shirt was tucked too tightly into his jeans. He stepped forward like he was walking through fire. He took the oath, sat down, and cleared his throat. "What happened the night of May 14th?" the prosecutor asked. Ethan hesitated, then spoke. "I was driving home from my cousin's birthday party. I hadn't been drinking. I wasn't speeding. I signaled every turn." His voice cracked, but he kept going. "But they pulled me over anyway, said I looked agitated." "Who pulled you over, Ethan?" "Officers Mason and Whitmore." Mason shifted in his seat. Whitmore stared at the table. "And what happened next?" "I asked what I did wrong. That's it." "I wasn't loud. I didn't argue. I just asked." "But Mason reached in and pulled me out of the car, said I was non-compliant, slammed me onto the pavement before I could say another word." "Did you resist?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "I was scared." "But I didn't resist, and they cuffed me anyway. My mouth was bleeding." "They left me on the side of the road for 15 minutes before even calling it in." The courtroom was silent, except for the prosecutor's voice. "Did they ever explain the stop?" "No," Ethan whispered. "Not then." "Not now." Danielle took notes quietly. Her face didn't move, but her pen moved with purpose. She had heard stories like this before, hundreds of them. From clients, from families, from communities used to being silenced. But hearing it from Ethan under oath in her courtroom, it hit differently. This wasn't just testimony. It was a mirror. The defense attorney rose next. Older man, expensive suit. A voice polished by decades of rationalizing the indefensible. "Mr. Rhodes, could it be that your own behavior contributed to the officer's reaction?" "I asked a question," Ethan replied. "That's it." "And the officers believed the situation was escalating?" "I believe," Ethan said, his voice rising, "they were escalating it." The silence that followed was deafening. Mason and Whitmore were called to testify later that afternoon. Their stories stumbled. Their language faltered. They clung to protocol and instinct, to training and misunderstanding. But none of it stuck. Not under oath. Not in that room, because every word was being weighed against Ethan's bruises. Danielle's silence. And a nation that was finally watching. By the end of the day, Mason's voice was barely above a whisper. "I made a judgment call," he muttered. Danielle looked up for the first time. "And do you still believe it was the right one?" the prosecutor asked. Mason hesitated. "No," he said, not an apology, but something close. Outside, reporters waited for a quote. Inside, Danielle simply said, "Court is adjourned for today. We reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow." Then she stood, and for the first time since the hearings began, the entire room stood with her. The verdict came on a Monday morning. Cold light spilled through the windows of courtroom 3B, sharpening every edge of the room. The gallery was full, reporters pressed against the back wall, notepads ready, cameras lowered, but recording. Citizens of Greenville filled every seat, some in silence, others clasping hands in anxious solidarity. Danielle Monroe entered last. Her black robe swept the floor like a shadow behind her. She carried no visible expression, only a worn leather folder, thin but heavy with consequence. She took her seat behind the bench, adjusted her glasses, and began. This court has reviewed all testimony, exhibits, and procedural documentation in the matter of Officers Mason and Whitmore. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The role of law enforcement, she continued, is not simply to enforce the law, but to embody its spirit, with restraint, with equity, with integrity. No one moved. The behavior demonstrated by Officers Mason and Whitmore was not only a breach of protocol, she said, pausing to let her words settle. It was a breach of public trust, a trust that is not easily restored once broken. Whitmore shifted in his seat, blinking hard. Mason stared down at the table, his hands clasped, knuckles white. Danielle lifted her eyes. Effective immediately, Officers Mason and Whitmore are suspended from duty, without pay, for a period of 180 days. A low gasp rippled through the back row. They are further required to complete a certified retraining program in de-escalation, constitutional rights, and anti-bias intervention at their own expense. She let that sink in. And this violation, she concluded, will remain permanently on their service records to be disclosed in all future internal evaluations and transfer requests. The room was silent, balanced, precise, unflinching, not revenge. Reform. Danielle closed the folder gently. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck once, but its echo lingered far longer than wood on wood should. As the room began to stir, papers rustling, chairs sliding, Officer Mason stood, slowly, cautiously. He looked up at the woman he once handcuffed in front of a crowd like she was a threat to be neutralized. And he spoke. "Your Honor," his voice cracked, almost inaudible. "I'm sorry." Danielle looked at him, not down, not through. At him, long enough to make him uncomfortable, long enough to remind him that sorry doesn't erase a record, or a bruise, or a memory. She gave a single, slow nod. Acknowledgement, not absolution, because forgiveness is not automatic. And justice does not forget. As the courtroom emptied, people paused, some to shake her hand, others to simply meet her eyes. They didn't say, "Congratulations." They said, "Thank you." Danielle stayed seated for a few more minutes after the last person left. She stared at the folder in front of her, not with satisfaction, but with the deep, quiet understanding that one verdict does not fix a broken system, but it does make a crack. And from that crack, light can get in. The courtroom had emptied, but the reverberations of Danielle Monroe's verdict lingered. The gavel's final strike had not just concluded a case, it had ignited a movement. In the weeks that followed, Danielle found herself amidst a whirlwind of community gatherings. Church basements, school auditoriums, and local community centers became arenas where voices long silenced finally spoke. These meetings, often organized by grassroots groups, provided a platform for individuals to share their encounters with systemic injustice. At one such gathering, a young man named Marcus stood up, his voice trembling. "I was stopped last month for walking home from work. No reason, just suspicion." His story was met with nods of recognition, a shared understanding of the pervasive nature of racial profiling. Danielle listened intently, her legal expertise now serving as a bridge between the community and the justice system. She offered guidance on legal recourse, emphasizing the importance of documentation and collective action. The viral video of her own arrest had become a catalyst, inspiring others to come forward. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags demanding accountability, and local news outlets began to highlight stories of similar injustices. The community's collective voice grew louder, impossible to ignore. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting, an elderly woman approached Danielle. Her hands, weathered by time, clasped Danielle's with a firmness that belied her age. "You did what our whole generation has been waiting for," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "You stood up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." Danielle felt the weight of those words settle upon her. Her fight was no longer just personal. It was emblematic of a broader struggle for justice and equality. In the days that followed, Danielle collaborated with local organizations to establish workshops aimed at educating citizens about their rights. She advocated for policy reforms, emphasizing the need for transparency and accountability within law enforcement agencies. Her efforts were met with both support and resistance, but she remained undeterred. The community's resilience inspired her. Stories of pain were interwoven with tales of hope and determination. Together, they envisioned a future where justice was not selective, but universal. ChicagoPolice.org. As Danielle walked through the neighborhoods of Greenville, she was often greeted with nods of respect and gratitude. Murals depicting scenes of unity and resistance adorned walls that once bore the scars of neglect. The city was transforming, not just physically, but in spirit. The echoes of justice, once a distant dream, now resonated through every street and alley. And at the heart of it all stood Danielle Monroe, a testament to the power of resilience, advocacy, and unwavering commitment to change. The wind that afternoon carried something different. Not just the rustle of protest signs or the rhythmic chant of a marching crowd, but something heavier. Older. A quiet reckoning is long overdue. Danielle Monroe stood on the courthouse steps, her black coat fluttering softly behind her. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The street below spoke for her. A sea of young people moved forward, peaceful, steady, determined. They held cardboard signs painted with words that didn't beg. They declared, "Justice starts with us. Accountability is not optional. We will not be silenced." Danielle's eyes scanned the crowd. She saw faces, black, white, brown, tired, defiant, hopeful. Teenagers with backpacks, elders in wheelchairs, parents with strollers. No one is waiting for permission to care. No one is asking if the system should change. Only how? She thought of the courtroom, now empty, of Mason's pale face when he realized the judge was the woman he once handcuffed without cause. Of Ethan's voice, trembling but unwavering, of the old woman who squeezed her hand and whispered, "You did what our generation waited a lifetime to see." Danielle had issued a ruling. But the truth was, justice didn't end with a gavel. It didn't live in legal codes or verdicts alone. Justice was slower, heavier, messier. It was the process of reclaiming dignity. One story, one protest, one refusal to look away at a time. And justice didn't arrive. It had to be built. She had always believed in the law. But belief wasn't enough anymore. Not when so many still feared the very uniforms meant to protect them. Not when silence was still expected. Not when power still answered to no one until it was forced. Danielle took a breath as a group of students walked past her, eyes lit with purpose. One of them, barely 17, raised a fist toward her in quiet solidarity. She raised her hand back. A silent promise returned. The camera panned out slowly. The march stretched for blocks. No screaming, no rage, just steady steps, clear voices, and signs that refuse to fade. And Danielle, standing still at the top of those courthouse steps, not as a victim, not just as a judge, but as something more. A witness to change, a steward of the truth, a reminder that no matter how high the walls of the system are built, truth, once spoken, finds the cracks. Justice is not a sentence. It is a process of reclaiming dignity. And if this system is ever going to change, it has to start with the truth. Subscribe to this channel if you believe silence is no longer an option. Share this story so no one thinks they're alone in the fight. Raise your voice, because justice doesn't happen by accident. This isn't just content, it's a movement. Join us.